Yes, sir.
Where's your view?
So my view is here. So in AngularJS, and we'll get into this more into the next module, your view is your HTML. Technically, your view is HTML with Angular baked into it. So once it's actually been bound or compiled by AngularJS, and it's been bound to your scope, that becomes your view. And so that's when I was talking about kind of the low, kind of eliminating that friction point, is because it is HTML, is you can literally take a layout from a designer and you're pretty much there, like that is your view. And then you can interpolate it and basically bake your Angular into it. So it's a really nice workflow. But I'll get more into that into the next module. Did you have, I mean, does that make sense, or?
Well, I noticed from following the tutorial, the Google tutorial, and I set something up that was my own example working from that tutorial. And I set up a couple controllers and I put them on the page, and I was with one of my coworkers, and we took the controller off the page and it still worked. And the controller is where the service call was being made.
Okay.
And I just tried that with the hello example, and I won't get the scope if I remove that controller.
Right.
But I noticed you don't have a view on this page, and I had a view on my.
So the question that is being asked is, where is the view in AngularJS? And so the answer to that, the simplest answer is that the view is basically your HTML. Once it has been compiled by AngularJS, now what you may be referring to is ngView.
Yes.
Yes. And so that is another directive that is essentially used to define the view when you are using it in conjunction with routes. And so that's not the view as like the capital V view in the MV whatever. And so that is just a way to actually say, when I'm doing routing, is, you know, basically the route maps a controller to a view and then binds and basically puts that all together for you. And that's what ngView is for. But it certainly is not necessary, because there are times when you will build an AngularJS application and you may not need a routing mechanism. And so in that case, you would not have ngView. It's certainly not required for an Angular application, but it does serve a very specific and useful purpose unto itself. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool.
And sorry to ask so many questions up front, but can you have more than one ngView?
No.
Okay.
And so that's the limitation. We'll get into that later, but there is a great library called UI Router that kind of overcomes that problem. So it'll allow you to actually have multiple views in your layout and then kind of target specific pieces of that. So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more, but it's basically the limitation with route is that it's one view, one controller per page, which is fine until it's not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's very helpful.
Cool.
Yeah,
All right.
so.
+1. But good question. I appreciate it. If anybody wants to ask any questions, take it from him. He is rocking. Rocking in the question department.
One person on chat's asking what exactly is $scope.
So I will get to that in the next module. But essentially, $scope is a plain JavaScript object that has some event handlers baked into it during the compilation process that is used to basically set up kind of the two-way data binding between basically the view and whatever's in the controller. So it's just basically a JavaScript object with some event handlers that allows for two-way data binding. Does that make sense?
So it's given by the AngularJS framework?
Yeah, so it's an Angular like mechanism, and then that's what enables two-way data binding as a whole, is because it's just this JavaScript object with these event hooks baked into it. Starting from the root scope all the way down to every scope object within your application. Interestingly enough is that if you're using, so I will rarely touch root scope But if you need to use it, I will use it as an event bus when I'm communicating between controllers. And so it's really easy to inject root scope, and I'll show you an example of this in a little bit, but inject it into your services and then use it just as an event bus to say, hey, this happened, and so other controllers will know about it. So, yes, sir?
Why you have to add a $sign on the name?
So it's just the Angular kind of namespace that they've chosen to use. So generally, even if you go into the documentation, they say the $sign is Angular. Try to refrain from using it if you want, or try to refrain from using it because it may cause collisions. But that's just to denote that, hey, this is an Angular provided mechanism. So you have like $scope, $root scope, $HTTP, and so you'll start to. It's just an easy way to delineate. This is my stuff, and then this is the Angular stuff.
So is all the Angular library variable you kind of start with $?
Generally, yes. I mean, it might even be 100%, but I wouldn't stake my life on it, but I think it is 100%. That's kind of the convention that they use. And so you'll start to see a lot of that. So I'll point that out for you. But any other questions?
Can I have two controllers defined within the same module?
Yes. So you can have multiple controllers as well as you have explicit and implicit creation of controllers. So for instance, if you have like a repeater, it will go through and basically stamp out an item based one per item in your collection. Well, each one of those gets a child scope. But if you have like a directive in there, you can actually define a controller, and it will get a controller as well. And so you can actually, the entire way that Angular is put together in terms of from an application standpoint, is you have kind of this macro level, but then you can, like a fractal, have that same pattern on very like kind of micro condensed levels within like directives or whatever. Does that make sense? Perfect. Any other questions? We are getting right into the good stuff, right out of the gates. This is awesome. Mark?
I mean, there's a few in the chat, actually 4 or 5, but I don't know if we want to kind of put those into moderator and keep going.
Yeah, let's put them in. I think that a lot of questions that we're going to get right now, and feel free to ask them at the same time as I think a lot of kind of the fundamental like nuts and bolts we're going to get to in the next module. So we'll kind of go through that, and then we'll kind of see where everybody's at. So I'll make sure we'll do a good Q&A after I get to the kind of the foundation part. And so now, moment of truth. Did I mess this up? Bam! No, I did not. Let me, we'll see if this, So, hello front-end masters. Ta-da! And so the beauty of this is, you can go, see if this will, and so now I'm binding to the same variable. And so when I update it in one place, it updates in the other. The point of this is that your DOM is no longer the single source of truth. That variable on scope is now your single source of truth, which makes it really easy to test because you're separating your declarative markup and your imperative behavior. It's hard to test layout. It's possible, but it's hard. It's tricky. But testing imperative logic, especially when it's well written, is really easy. And so that is pretty incredible that I'm basically binding to this thing and I'm updating it in real time. And notice, going back to my claim that it will save you hundreds of lines of code, is where's my event handlers? It doesn't exist. I was able to do this with just a few lines of code, 2 or 3 lines of code. And now I have these 2 controls, these 2 elements sharing the same model. Does that make sense? Okay.